In this lesson, we're going to learn two different ways to model vertical screens. Now, if you have a look at the plan of our building, we have this very large scale screen that is sitting along these four glazed walls, and then we have a slightly different type of screen that is in front of our bathroom area. So this screen here is going to be almost a fine timber lattice that is just going to run up the side of our building, and the screen that we have here is going to be a lot more complex, perhaps something that is framed, something that might have an internal element. So the way that we model them can also be quite different. Now I'm going to show you how we model these two screens in a slightly different method for both. So just like with the window frames, I'm going to show you your option A and option B so that you can then decide which of those two you really prefer using. So what I would recommend with a more complex screen is that you model them as individual objects and then instance them from one to the other. So let's first of all go and make a new layer. We're going to call this one 03 screens. And let's go and choose a color of some sort. So let's choose a type of purpley blue color. And I'm going to start with a simple box. The box is going to be 3.5 meters high, since that is the height from the floor to the ceiling. And you can then go and instance that around. Before you do instance it, just think to yourself if you do want to work with a solid element or if you would rather like to have an internal element within it. But if you don't know just yet and you're developing the design, you can also just leave it as a box and it will almost act as a placeholder. So I will show you very shortly what I mean by this. What I'm going to do first is I'm going to instance it to the other locations. So I'm just going to instance that. I'm not sure how many there are, so I'm just going to take a rough guess at 20 and then delete the excess that was created. And I can then go and repeat that process to all of the others. Now the beauty about this is that I first of all have the dimensions within the object itself. So if a client asks me how wide is your screen, I can just go and have a look and it will tell me that it's 3 centimeters wide. So the other thing that is really great about this is that because I have a single object, I can now go up into my modify stack and I can start doing interesting things to it. So for example, I could take these two side faces and I could create a frame just by inserting those. So let's go and insert this by 5 centimeters. Well, let's make it a little bit less, so let's say 2.5. And then I could extrude that inwards to make it look slightly thinner, but not too much so that they overlay. And then that internal panel, I could give a separate material ID to. So this could be ID 2, and then I could just type in Control-I on my keyboard, and that would be ID 1. So now what I've created is a framed element that I could texture with a multi ID material, and it would give me a texture for the internal fill and it would give me a different texture for the external frame. So the beauty is that whatever you do, you now have control over all of your screens on your entire building just by working with one on the as a reference basically. So this will all be instanced. The other beautiful thing about this is that if you want to animate your screens, you could take one of those screens and you could turn it, for example, so you could show your client what they would look like if they're all closed, and you could animate that without any problem. So it really does give you quite a lot of flexibility. If you do, however, start having a whole lot of little joints, pins, rotating devices, etc., just remember to group each one of them and instance it across so that you do have a neater assembly to work with so that you don't have too many objects. So the second method that we're going to use is one that is slightly more similar to what we did with the window frames. So I'm just going to do it relatively quickly since I don't want to do too much of repetition so that you don't so that you aren't told things too many times over. But I'm just going to run through the same process. So we draw a line from beginning to end. We're going to extrude it up by 3.5. We're then going to add an editable poly. And we're going to select both edges. So I'll just use the ring command to select both. I'm then going to connect those with the amount of times as there are screens. So let's just see if that's right. So that looks correct. You could just double check that. And then it's always best to have these lines in the center of the actual object. So it would be a good idea to know as well what the exact distance is, or you could also use your snap So this will be about minus 0.25. That sounds about correct. And once you have that, you can still keep those verticals selected. Then just go down and create a shape out of that selection, or linear. And then the object that is left over, in other words, the editable poly, which was your reference object, you can either hide it, you can delete it, or you can just put it on a layer which you have turned off during your renders, so that you have this as your base object for all your screens. In case you want to come back and you want to just redo the amount of screens that there are, you could basically have that so that you don't have to redo everything over and over again. So that's a nice tip for you, just to always hide or freeze those objects that you don't that you would like to use again, but that you don't want to see in your render. So I'm going to delete it for now, since I'm going to ignore the little tip. And I just want to focus on the workflow so that you see exactly how this is done. So what we have now is a single editable spline made out of separate elements. So it's one object with multiple separate splines, and this can now be swept just like we did with our window frame. You will have a look, however, that you do get this odd arrangement, so that's why having them at the center always ends up being the best. So even though you have a very neat object, it still does help if you center your actual editable spline in the beginning. So they're in the center here, but it also helps if you place them into the center of the center. So you can just have a look and either do it by snapping. I'm just going to do it by eye, since I don't need to be that accurate in this case. And then using your width and your length, you can just adjust those amounts manually using the parameters, using the spinners. So this will be, I think, this will be 775. So 75 by 5, so that is the size of the screen. So this can now get textured as one single object, and again, the beauty of it is that we can now have the length and the width that is controllable. We have everything as a single object, and that's my favorite part, is that you don't have a group of 200 different objects. It's a single element, and this is what I have used in the past when, for example, you have a lattice facade where you have hundreds of thousands of little strips running along your entire building. I've just used a single editable spline with a sweep, so that is a really nice way to do it. The beauty as well is here that you have your corner radius, so you could have, let's say, a 2mm corner radius. So instead of adding an editable poly and chamfering and all that, you can just get that all done as well. So you could decrease the amount of steps that you have so that you don't have such a complicated curve. Even 0 is good enough, so that you just have a plain chamfer. So all of these things are really great, so definitely use them. Definitely try and simplify your objects so that, for example, here you have one object, here you have a single object with a multi-material, and everything is instanced. So there is this correlation where you could adjust one parameter and your entire object changes across your entire project. So that definitely does help. There's nothing worse than having to edit something like a screen and having to edit each portion of the screen separately. You want to basically edit one parameter and your whole building changes, and that's where your speed of modeling and speed of editing comes, where you basically program your building in that way, where you build it and you basically control it with one single point. So that is all I wanted to discuss in this lesson. Hope that gave you a tiny bit more insight. I know it may have been quite repetitive from the window frames, but at least you would see a few more different options as well to broaden your ideas. So great, thanks for listening, and in the next lesson we're going to continue on the ground floor, and shortly after we're going to start building the slabs on the upper levels and then start finishing off the building step by step.